Hello, everyone. My name is Cynthia Demise, and I'm the project manager of the new Pride Agenda. We have formally been working for about a year now, started last July 2019. We're a very small startup nonprofit, but our interest and ambition is to try to work with many LGBT colleagues in New York State and continue pushing the envelope regarding education, advocacy, civic engagement for transgender, non-conforming, non-binary communities, people of color, people that have less resources. Some of us were involved with the prior Empire State Pride Agenda, and were very dismayed and concerned when it closed after the passage of marriage equality. Obviously, there's much, much more work to do. What you're partaking in right now is a virtual town hall series that we started just as the epidemic of COVID began in March. And we've done one every 2 weeks, focusing on healthcare and mental health and race and sexual health and immigration and numerous other topics. And we're very pleased to have a wonderful panel tonight. The two things I'm just going to mention are we have a website, www.newprideagenda.org. And there are two important things that are on a little bit of a deadline. One is we have partnered with Columbia University to do a major LGBTQ survey starting in New York City, and then we're going to go Long Island, Westchester, and upstate. It takes only 10 minutes to fill it out. It's rigorous regarding their standards. We have almost 1,000 people that have signed it, have done it, and we would love for you to fill that out before the 31st, July 31st. It's the end of our period regarding the survey, and we're interested in your point of view, your issues, your concerns, your feelings about local electeds, etc. So please take 10 minutes over the weekend and fill it out. If there's a question you don't like, you don't have to answer it. It can be done by our community and allies. And we'll be happy to report and be public about those findings. The second thing is that we are looking for an executive director. I've been a project manager just getting it going, and I will help with the board of directors, of course, but we're looking for an executive director. And that search process will end Monday, August 3rd. And so for those of you that want to take on taking New Pride Agenda to the next level, we welcome your application. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Ahmed Mohammed, one of our great community organizers. Thank you for joining us. I'll catch you later. Ahmed?
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to be brief and just talk about logistics. So first and foremost, we recommend you place your screen in gallery view. That way it could be more conversational and see everyone's beautiful faces. If you have a question or comment, we encourage your activity in the Q&A chat feature along the bottom of your screen. I'll be making sure that those questions get to our moderator, and hopefully we'll get it answered for you. And then if you run into any technical difficulties, I'll also post my number in the chat box. So just shoot me a text and I'll try to troubleshoot. But yeah, thank you for joining us. I'll pass it off to Jason, who's going to talk about the topic tonight. Yeah.
Thanks, Ahmed. I'm going to be equally brief because I'm really super excited to hear what our panel has to offer and share with us. This conversation is going to center on our struggle and our fight for economic justice in New York City and our communities. We have some amazing, beautiful faces here who are leading the charge for economic justice in New York City and across the state. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our moderator.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. My name is Imara Jones, and I am the moderator for tonight. I am also a board member of the New Pride Agenda and thrilled to be hosting this discussion tonight on economic justice and economic justice for LGBTQ communities across New York State. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, because before I started my current job as the founder and creator of Translash, which is a journalism and storytelling project which centers the narratives of trans people at a time of social backlash. You should go to our website, www.translash.org, to sign up for our newsletter. But before I started Translash, my career as a journalist actually focused on economic justice. That was my beat, and that was my beat for a while. And I have a master's degree in economics, and so tonight the fact that I can combine all the things that I have worked on through journalism and through economics and through advocating for our community tonight in this conversation is absolutely a thrill to me. And we have an incredible panel, as has been alluded to, in terms of us being able to make sure that we have the voices and the perspectives that are going to help center exactly where we are on economic justice. And so we are going to have a really full conversation throughout the evening. We want you to be a part of it. So please make sure that you post your comments in our comments section and in our chat so that we can be sure to include your perspectives, because we want this to be as wide-ranging a conversation about where we are as possible. So I'd like to start by introducing our various guests. It's not in any particular order because everyone's Zoom order is like, it scrambles the deck. So it will not necessarily be in order of the way that you see them, but trust me, it will be everyone who is on the panel. We have Jason Wu, who is a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society, a trustee of the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys, and UAW Local 2325, and a political chair for GAPIMNY, an all-volunteer group that focuses on empowering queer and transgender Asian Americans in New York City. He has written extensively on housing, education, policing, and systemic racism. Welcome, Jason. Our next guest is Jawanza James Williams, who uses the pronouns of he and him. Jawanza is a Black queer socialist community organizer. He is currently the director of organizing at Vocal NY. He is also, or Vocal New York, he is also a founding member of the Afro Socialist and Socialists of Color Caucus of the Democratic Socialist of America. Welcome, Jawanza. Next is Wen Parasamy, who is a law student at Fordham Law School, where they are also a Stein Scholar and Crowley Scholar, very scholarly. They are a core team member with the Campaign for New York Health, and they use the pronouns of they and she. Wen, welcome, and thank you for joining us. And last but certainly not least is a person who needs very few introductions. That's Kiara St James, who is the executive director of NITAG. And Kiara also mentioned that she is an activist and needs few introductions because, her reputation precedes her. So Kiara, thank you so much for joining us as well. Welcome, everyone. I wanted to ground our conversation before we go into kind of your general thoughts tonight with what the economic state is, especially for some of the most vulnerable members of our community, and that's trans people. I think that often people don't understand the economic plight. We are so, for very obvious reasons, focused on violence against us in terms of murders. We're very focused on police violence and the way in which the state oppresses us, but there's also another form of oppression that we undergo, which is through economic injustice, which we're going to unpack tonight. And for trans people who we can use kind of as, the most marginalized of the marginalized of our community, overall, I think some of the knowledge would shock people. I think, it's important for us to remember that trans people are very much economically undersourced with regards to income. Trans people are 4 times more likely to earn less than $10,000 a year. 4 times more likely than the general population to hold that particular economic status. Trans people are twice as likely to be jobless. And for Black trans people, that's 4 times as likely. And 1 out of 5 trans people has experienced a housing discrimination, with the same having experienced homelessness. And so often the stereotype for our communities overall, for LGBTQ people, is that we're an over-resourced community. The stereotype is that that LGBTQ people, specifically the G and the L, are wealthy, are usually white, are highly educated. And while that's true for a minority of our community, that's not where most of our community is. And so in order to unpack kind of what underlies that and the ways in which we can move beyond that is going to be the focus of our discussion tonight. So thank you for that. I think before we talk about all of the things that are wrong, these conversations often start how everything is falling apart. I wanted to start out with the positive vision that you all have, each of you has, for economic justice. What does economic justice for our community look like, and what, from your perspective, are the underpinnings of that? And I'm gonna kick this conversation out. I'm gonna ask each of you the same question, so no one gets off scot-free. You'll just have more time to come up with your answer. But for a person who probably already has this answer in the can, I'm gonna start out with you, Kiara. Which for you, when you are fighting and advocating for trans people through NITAG, what for you is the expansive vision for economic justice?
Thank you so much, Imara. So I definitely feel that the work that I do with Jawanza and Jason, it really merges and speaks to all of our intersectionality. And so, like, I spoke at Defund the Police along with Jawanza and Jason. And so, like, understanding, like, that's where we start reallocating funds that are needed for our communities. And so, like, this is not a new conversation, but I do feel that because of all the national uprisings, there's more attention being brought to it, and there's more support behind it. But in addition to that, I've been a long believer in fighting for universal basic income, which also, because of COVID-19, shows why everyone needs to have a basic level of income to survive and to be sustainable. And so I think that this is a very important conversation to have, and, like, it's about equity. I think too often people say justice, justice. We want justice, but we want equity justice now, right? We need to make sure that that's the fight. And anyone that knows me knows I'm blackity black, right? People know this. So it's rooted in, I tell people all the time when they say, well, it's a good start, when we hear, like, for instance, Black Lives Matter, people are doing this Black Lives Matter, corporations, and I'm like, okay, enough. And people tell me, well, it's a start, Kiara. And I'm like, we've been in this nation, when I say we, I'm talking about Black folks, for 465 years. So ain't no good start, because we're 465 years behind. So the fight must be about demanding, right? Demanding equity, demanding generational wealth be restored to not just meet my identity as a Black trans woman, but Black people in general. And so that is where the focus is with me. I just had an amazing conference call with Senator Kevin Parker, who is my senator here in Flatbush. And so some of the things we talked about is creating, specifically for Black and Latinx trans women, co-ops, right? Where trans women can come and whether they're doing hair, nails, there's a space for them to make a living. And so those are what I'm really interested in, like, being part of getting those of us who do community work connected to our elected officials, who are also connected to a lot of these corporations and foundations, to really address at the root why Black trans women have the highest unemployment rate in the nation.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so it's underscoring, as you say, making sure that we have a floor for people with universal basic income, that we have resources for people to be able to create their own business, this general resourcing through government that we know is possible. I mean, who knew that the government, could essentially write, everyone a $2,400 check before COVID? That would have been unthinkable. But as you say, the landscape has changed during COVID. So Jawanza, because Kiara named you, and because we touched on the issue of universal basic income, which would seem to be an issue that would be, given your interest as a DSA, a place for us to start from. What is your vision for economic justice in New York? And, just to piggyback off of the conversation, how does universal basic income, ensuring that there is a minimum living standard for everyone that would be guaranteed by the government through direct payments, how does that factor into your thinking as well for what that vision is?
So first, thank you so much, Imara. I really appreciate it. I deeply love and appreciate Kiara, my sister. And also want to thank New Pride Agenda for holding this conversation, and also my colleague, Jason Walker, for making sure that I was a part of this conversation. I really appreciate that. And I think a number of things about economic justice. And I think to sort of center and talk about the experiences of Black trans people economically is critical for us to be able to solve any kind of crisis. In the same way that we have to be able to understand and implicate capitalism and the ways in which our economy and our culture supports a way of organizing wealth and organizing ourselves that lead to the crises and the consequences that ultimately lead to the death and destruction and instability that people experience, in particular Black trans people. So I think that my economic vision for New York City and New York State really is wrapped up with my economic vision for the whole world. And we have to be able to understand that it's not just that people are having a difficult time because of disenfranchisement in this society. That's true, because that's true for 465 years, as Kiara noted, but there is no equity, there is no justice when we organize ourselves with the idea of markets, because I think that essentially capitalism requires that there are people, that there are bodies that whose life is less valuable than the elite, whose time is not as valuable as another person's time, because it functions that way. So at the end of the day, we have to be able to say, this is not a viable way to organize our economy. So we need to start there first, baseline. Because the UBI, for instance, only is necessary because of the ways in which our society's economy is organized. So it's a sort of vehicle for stability, but it doesn't get to the root of the crisis. So I think that one of the things that we need to do is to be able to understand the inherent problematic nature or functionality of public-private partnerships. We don't want our government working with private institutions like banks to determine how we're going to, support people living in this country, for instance. So that means with campaigns like DSA's public power campaign or public banking campaign. How about we remove the middlemen, which I think I hope Wynn talks a bit about this, how single payer healthcare isn't enough, because it's also not just about, the insurance, our access to medicine or access to care, but it's also about the markets that are produced, that are inherently exploitative, intentionally about creating and producing profits. So I think that we have to do two things. We have to do these things simultaneously. One, we do need to implement programs like universal basic incomes, because the reality is that people today are in material conditions that need to be addressed so they can survive. Because to build the kind of world and society that I'm talking about, to build the kind of anti-capitalist economy and culture that I'm talking about, which is a culture of equity, a culture of justice, a culture of inclusion, a culture rooted in love and compassion, which is antithetical to this culture of annihilation, this culture of violence, this culture of exploitation that we understand to be reality today. And that leads to the outcomes that we all have that are problematic, that leads to ultimately to Black death and to all death. And in my opinion, I use the word annihilation intentionally because I think that capitalism and the culture that it produces, that it requires to exist, will lead to the annihilation of people. And I don't think that we'll be able to solve any problems like the climate crisis until Black trans lives matter, because Black trans people and Black people in general and oppressed people all across this planet are the ones that are going to be experiencing the brunt of the climate crisis. So I'm drawing all these connections intentionally. It seems a bit wide ranging, but the ways in which the things that we're responding to is not linear. It is a webbed phenomenon, and we need to apply an analysis that has a webbed response. So I know I'm taking up a lot of space now, but basically what I'm trying to say in a nutshell is that I think that my economic vision for New York City and New York State is that we as a people, capital P people, began to take back the economic direction of our society from institutions whose sole purpose is the bottom line for their board of directors.
Mm-hmm. Decentering corporations. Jason, what is your vision for economic justice in New York State?
Hi, everyone. So thank you for allowing me to participate in this conversation. I'm in awe of my co-panelists and our moderator and everyone else. And I'm really just grateful to be here. And there's not a lot that I need to add. You know, Kiara and Jawanza kind of laid it down, and I agree. I co-sign everything that they said. And I think part of what I'm hearing from both of them is identifying a world in which we stop blaming individuals, particularly intersectionally vulnerable individuals, for the problems of systemic racism and gender-based violence and all these other systems that create inequality in our society. And so I think economic justice requires us to move away from blaming individuals and shifting into a systemic analysis and moving towards systemic solutions. And I would just add that I think the current moment around defund the police, which many of the people on this panel have worked on, is really important, because abolition is not only what we're against, it's not just about what we're against in terms of police violence, but it's also about what we want for our society. It's about reprioritizing our needs, reprioritizing or redefining what public safety looks like. So public safety is not what we've been taught and socialized to believe. It's not that we need police to protect certain people from other people. And by other people, that's often cast as Black people. We need to redefine public safety so that we understand that housing is a public safety issue. That when people don't have housing, they're not safe. When people don't have healthcare, they're not safe. When people don't have access to economic opportunities, they're not safe. And so we need to redefine public safety. We need to actually put the needs of people first, and we need to move away from criminalization and systems that continue to oppress and inflict more violence on vulnerable communities. And so I want to just underscore that abolition is a vision for economic justice. Yeah, and I'll stop there.
Great. Wen, what are your thoughts?
I mean, honestly, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. Honestly, all of you have laid out such a comprehensive and beautiful and important vision for economic justice. I apologize for the noise. My roommate, a cat, is having some emotions, but I think the things that I might just add are that that I see abolition as sort of abolition across fields as well. I'm in addition and really kind of taking the lead from the abolitionist space in the criminal, the abolitionists in the criminal justice space and the Black abolitionists in the criminal justice space. I also think sort of deeply about disability in healthcare and across these spaces, and in our LGBTQ community, we see a lot of the sort of layers of being Black, and brown and Indigenous and disabled and low income. We see these impacts sort of hit and hit and hit. And I think a lot about how I want to see abolition across spaces and liberation across spaces. So for instance, I want to see what it looks like to build our road toward abolishing nursing homes and really making it so that we an important part of single payer that disabled activists in particular really led the charge on is including long-term care and supports into the national as well as the New York State bills, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about that later. But we looking at how we fund home and community-based supports so that people can grow old, can be supported, can live the lives that they want to live with dignity and with honor and truth in their own communities. And I want to see more in healthcare. One thing that I really enjoyed this past year is coalition partners across New York working on on communicating more to each other about what, and really actually actively supporting each other across healthcare and across policies and visionary work that is health and well-being. So being in support of Occupy City Hall, so being in support of repealing the walking while trans ban, because if you cannot exist without dignity and have safety in just your identity, like know that you are safe outside, how are you supposed to feel have health and well-being? If you are a sex worker and you are not allowed to do what you wish to do, to live in dignity and have security in your work, that's not health and well-being. Those are health justice issues. And so I want to, like, my vision personally of economic justice is really layering in abolition, layering in the idea that health and well-being is in every policy, is in every space. And we need to, it's a lot. That's a big thing to think of. Oh, we need to be in every space, but we need to be thinking about how we how we look to leaders in other spaces, how we collaborate, how we build the world that we want to see together, not just in our own silos. Because we also need to be making sure that that community members that are leading that charge, because if your own community doesn't believe in the policy that you're pushing, was that policy even worth it in the end? And so I know that's a lot, but I think that economic justice is a lot, and we should be as bold and visionary, and fight for everything we deserve, because we deserve nothing less.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. There are some specific questions that we have that I wanted to address in a minute, but I wanted to just press you all on something, and it comes out of reading I've been doing recently. So, I mean, Kiara mentioned some big ideas for economic justice, but then we moved into a space of talking about abolition, of tearing down various systems, which we all can agree needs to be done so. But I've been actually reading a lot about Reconstruction after the Civil War. And that was a prime example of abolition without a plan for investment or capitalization. And so if we just have an abolition of the many of the systems that oppress us, you know, what actually is the vision to replace those with things that are actually going to advance the world that we want, right? Just having abolition fill in the blank of all of these areas, which are really important. And so I'm wondering, you know, what are some of the other, to go on your point, what are some of the big ideas in economic justice that we think would make a really big impact in terms of the lives of LGBTQ community, in addition to some of the ones that we've touched upon?
So
this is jump ball.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna say, cause I just finished reading, like, for the 5th time, short history of the Reconstruction, and like in there, there's a chapter that talked about when the Northern industrialists got together with their defeated Southern cousins to really map out the next 10 years of the United States, right? So within that conversation, all these academics from the North said, and you mentioned, where is their place? This new,
Wait, am I the one? Kiara, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Am I all
Wait, hey Kiara, we're having a hard time hearing you, so we're gonna let your Wi-Fi settle for just a minute, and we'll come back to your point about the 10 years after Reconstruction in just a second. Does anyone else want to pick up on that question of what are some of the big kind of out there, or not even out there, ideas that are within our grasp or outside of our grasp or within our vision for what an economically just society would look like in a way that works for LGBTQ people?
I can jump in. So I think, you know, when you bring up Reconstruction following slavery, we also have to think about what followed Reconstruction, which is Jim Crow. And so our history reflects a history of what Kimberly Crenshaw calls race reform and retrenchment, where we try to make progress and then there's backlash. And we're in a moment of conflict within our society, which we've always been in a moment of conflict. This is just a continuation of that conflict. And I think part of where, you know, where our country has failed in terms of really addressing inequality, especially as it plays out in Black communities, is that we've never repaired the harm of slavery or Jim Crow or of all of the generations of law and policy that have created the inequality that we see. And so what we see is what we see now in terms of inequality is a product of systems and policies. And this has been created by society, it's been created by government. And so we can also use government and we can also use society to address those harms. And so, you know, that takes me to the point around conversations around reparations. So what does reparations look like? And so I'm sure my co-panelists have ideas around that. And I would just say that there's different ways to think about reparations. There's also ways to think about it in terms of particular systems, and institutions. So what does reparations look like in the context of education? Within universities like Harvard and many institutions that have been built on the exploitation and dispossessment of Black and indigenous people. What does reparations look like in the context of housing, right? And so there's a move for Black and indigenous communities to reclaim land and to rebuild a connection with land. And you know that can take the form of community land trusts. There's a move in New York City to build community land trusts across the city in different rapidly gentrifying communities. And so I think there's many ways that we can think about repairing that harm and building new institutions that provide stability and support and all of the things that we want in economic justice.
Yeah, and I think what's really important about what you just mentioned is that community land trust, some of these other things are like really about reshaping our consciousness around ownership, right? And what does ownership mean and who gets to benefit from ownership, and is ownership, you know, and who gets to benefit from capital. It's really, you know, this mass reimagination. It's not only redistributing, it's really reimagining our idea of who gets to be an owner and who gets to benefit from ownership and how that flows. And you've outlined how that can work in land, that works differently in healthcare, it can work differently in education, and alongside of these ideas about reparations. I think those are really important. Kiara, you were in the midst of giving us your brilliance, and then we had a technology thing. So I wanted to just come back to you.
No, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. You're good now.
Okay, so I'll try not to flail too much. So what I was saying is, so a question was asked, what about the non-manumission Negro? Where is their place in the new America of the next 10 years? So without hesitance, the Northern industrialists, primarily white men, said that there's no need to plan for the manumission Negro, but within 10 years, they would have died out, right? So one of the reasons why they felt that way was because of the fact that TB was really taking out a lot of our ancestors, a lot of enslaved Africans. Kind of like how COVID-19, similar, you know, we see Black folks being having a high mortality rate because of COVID-19. And so I wanted to, you know, root what we're talking about in that history of when we allow other people to plan our future for us, there is no future, right? They don't plan for us, they only plan for themselves. But also I feel it's important for us to understand we still get validation through westernized ideology and belief systems. All of us, for the most part, who's part of this, are part of indigenous cultures around the world. And how we came together was communal, right? We came together communal to support the elderly, the women, the children, and that was lost because of westernization. So now where we find ourselves in this country and in the Western world is dealing with a global pandemic, number one, that is really rooted in capitalism, but also the fact that a lot of us, we need, and we need to support one another. We need each other to survive. So when you hear, because I went to school, we all went to school, and the first thing they would tell a lot of us is what? The beauty of America is the rugged individualism of this nation, and that we all can make it on our own. But the reality is we can't make it on our own, right? The reality is that we do need one another in order to create a more affirming society and community for one another. So I really think it's important for us to understand, like, the root causes of all of our issues is Westernization, and how Westernization likes to hoard wealth. Why do we live in a country where it's acceptable to see homeless people in New York City, the wealthiest city in the world, right? Why is it acceptable to have oligarchs with trillion-dollar salaries and wealth, where there's people homeless on the streets and can't afford health care? So I really wanted to add that to this conversation for us to understand that it's about really how do we start to unpack and dismantle this Western mindset that we've been indoctrinated into, thinking that only way progress is Western, when progress is not Western. Progress is rooted in people. And Western society is not rooted in people, it's rooted in wealth and hoarding of resources.
Before we turn to audience questions, is there anyone else who wants to talk about specific ideas around ways to build the society that we are fighting for? There's several big ideas that have already been mentioned: land trust, universal basic income, reparations, chaining ownership models. I'm wondering, Gwen and Jawanza, what do you?
I think, several things. I also want to bring up public banking and like public power, the idea of removing private institutions from providing the essential services that human beings need to live decent and well lives. And also to Jason Wu's point about reparations, I think that there's a bill in Congress, HR 40, that has been introduced every year since 1989 that would establish a commission to study the sort of impacts of slavery on Black people in this country and develop proposals for reparations. I think we can't actually move the conversation forward for reparations if we don't actually have, a comprehensive attempt at trying to determine what that actually means. So I think that we need to make that happen. So perhaps New Pride Agenda can put that on their platform. And I think also there's other tools. And also we should remember that we are in an international conversation, multi-generational conversation, and that the sort of ways in which in our history, even as Black Americans, how we've responded to state violence, to white supremacy, and to economic devastation, and that applies to LGBTQ people because we've been responding the entire time, just not named in those narratives, is that we're not the only ones with certain kinds of experiences, and the solutions may already exist around the world. So we should remember to lean into our comrades. But also we do have a very unique and particular experience as Black people in the world. And so I think another thing that I would mention is concepts like as we're moving our sort of society away from the sort of culture of annihilation, I'm calling it now, and extraction, and capitalism, a culture of haves and have-nots. There's a middle point, and that's what we're trying to build right now. It's like, how do we move from this devastating model to something that's more equitable, that centers and affirms people like us? And one of those things in the middle is like, it's all the things that we're naming, like reparations, it's universal incomes, it's universal healthcare, but it's also things like maximum income. Modalities of determining like how much money does a person actually need. And another thing I wanted to just add before we move on was that I saw in the comment that someone asked about universal basic income and what that means. And one of the things for me that I think is important to understand is that the universal basic income is a response to the fact that people in general don't have guaranteed access to the essentials for human life, like housing, education, healthcare, social services, and clothing, et cetera. The universal basic income isn't about limiting people's ability to build wealth. It's about making sure that people have the ability to stay alive. But I think because of that, that limits the scope and the potential of the universal basic income to build the world that we want to build, but it does keep us alive to do the work to actually radically transform the society. But I do think from the culture and the sort of perspective of scarcity, this manufactured idea that capitalists use to hoard wealth and to divide all of us, I think it does interrupt that narrative. And so it is important to have. So I do believe in universal basic income.
Yeah, just to go on that point, just to answer the question technically. So universal basic income would figure out what people need to survive either in the United States overall or in a specific community, and guarantee that no one would fall below that level. So let's just say that the level of universal basic income in New York City, making up a number, is $45,000 a year. What we would say is that anyone who earns below $45,000 a year would have that gap closed by transfer payments from the government, just like you're getting right now through COVID, right? So if you earn $20,000 a year, you get an extra $2,000 a month from the government in order to compensate for that. And that is a way to move wealth from people who have been able to accumulate it greatly to elsewhere. Someone asked whether or not it is guaranteed by the government. Yes, it is guaranteed by the government. The government is what is the legal mechanism for that transfer payment of taxing people at a certain level who are wealthy and then moving that money through transfer payments, direct transfer payments through universal basic income. Right now, where there are some experiments in the United States that are run by nonprofits, nonprofits are the ones who are doing that. But in places in the world where there are government experiments around UBI, specifically in Scandinavia, those are government run. And so the idea would be that. And I think Kiara made a point earlier that she wanted everyone to know that universal basic income is not sort of pie in the sky. Universal basic income is being experimented with in the United States in over 10 localities across the United States. And there's been a lot of data gathered that it makes a huge difference in people's ability to live, and that most people, I think something like 85% of the people spend the money on basic necessities. So it doesn't go, I mean, for some reason, rich people are always think that poor people are careless with money, which I think is fascinating, right? How do you think poor people survive? It's because they actually are good with money. And so, the thing is that that money is used to keep people afloat. And so whatever that level is in your state or locality is what UBI would be able to used for. But I think, some of these ideas, I don't know if we'll have enough time to get into them tonight, but all of the ideas that people have spoken about tonight, public banking, that is to say, taking the profit out of banking so that more people have access to money, changing ownership, reparations, land trust, UBI, that there's a lot of experimentation in the United States and around the world with these ideas. And in many places, they're not actually considered to be radical. When I wanted to give you the opportunity to jump in on this big idea before we move into some more specific spaces.
Sure. So I think just to kind of think a little bit about some of the ideas, like some of the points that in particular Kiara and Jawanza were talking about, I want to sort of maybe take a bit of a, like an example model, like so thinking about healthcare in this moment right now. So healthcare as a system has been grounded in like a scarcity model, in the idea that we need to reduce costs and that we need to try to maximize efficiencies. All of those words that you hear capitalists use to make sure that access to basic care is harder and harder to get. And so when we think about that, that's not a public health model. That's not a population health or a health justice model. And that's part of how we landed in the circumstances that we're in now. I mean, it's known now a little bit more publicly that we had that over the course of 10 years, Governor Cuomo and policymakers on the state level had cut roughly 20,000 hospital beds worth, like the money, like roughly 20,000 hospital beds. What would that have looked like if we had started out this bed crisis in New York State even 20,000 beds more? What would that have looked like if we had the staff there further? What would that have looked like if we had invested in home and community-based supports, so that people could actually actually age in their homes and not end up in nursing homes? And what would that look like if what would that look like if we weren't cutting Medicaid during a pandemic? Like if we weren't doubling down on this idea that we have to cut and cut and cut. And instead, like, what would that look like if we had actually done wealth taxes, not just this year, but previously? Like, that we weren't, like, mutual aid is a beautiful, important model. It's something that, like, New Yorkers looking out for each other, that is incredible, but they should not be alone in doing that. And it should not be a segment of New Yorkers providing care and community and basic needs to each other. And so for me and for one of the communities that I work with, like the New York Health Act is a state level Medicare for all, universal guaranteed single payer model that has it has majority support in the Assembly, is one senator short of a majority in the Senate in New York. And we know that state level, local level solutions make national level movements. And so, like, what if we started here in our communities thinking about and acting on re-envisioning health justice, not only acting in healthcare alone, but looking at how we look towards food, housing, not means testing everything, not to saying, oh, you are worth our help. Everyone is worth support. Everyone is worth wellness and care. And so when I think about how we invest in big ideas, I think about just the fact that we should stop thinking so small.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to some of your points, it's interesting, right? I mean, the reason why we have to have mutual aid is because there's no UBI, right? There's no guaranteed standard for people to be able to meet basic needs, even in this moment. I don't want to it was a part of a lot of what you gave in there, but I just want to emphasize something that you said that is really relevant to our audience and to people listening tonight, is that you basically just spoke about the fact that in New York State, there is a bill to be able to provide universal health care to everyone in the state, that it's pending, and that's a real possibility for us, right? Because we know that health access is an issue. So can you just mention that again, that the name of the bill, that it does exist, and that we do have the possibility, even if it's not at the national level right now, in this state, to have universal healthcare for everybody, which of course is an economic issue.
Sure, yeah. It's called the New York Health Act. It has been around for longer than I have been alive, but it's actually, I think it might be 2 years older than it, but it has been growing in its movement for the last couple of years. It is Medicare for all on a state level. So you make sure that no copays, no deductibles, no premiums, paid based on a progressive taxation model based on how much you can actually afford. You are cutting out all of the middlemen, so not having to deal with the number of insurance forms and insurance people you have to go through to get gender affirming care, not having to negotiate your insulin, not having to really fight for the needs that you already deserve. And so it passed the Assembly a couple years in a row. It hasn't been brought to a vote this year, but it still has majority support. In the Senate, it is one senator short of a majority. Some of those primary results that have occurred recently make me personally pretty excited about where we are in numbers games in the Senate, and not just for the New York Health Act, but for so many things for our communities, and I am very excited about that. But yeah, it's called the New York Health Act, and if you are interested in learning more, follow the Campaign for New York Health, and we want to build this society together. So join us.
Yeah, it's also a link to the campaign is in our group chat. So, you know, we have a lot of big ideas here, just to reiterate. And the reason why I think it's really important to talk about the specific things that we can change is because we need to give people a sense that we can build an economy that does work for everybody and that there are lots of ideas out there. So we spoke about land trusts and universal basic income, reparations, changing ownership models, public banking. You added universal healthcare, Medicare for all. But Jason, you wanted to make a point going back to community land trust, that that community land trust linked to trans history. So in your thoughts about how that's the case and why community land trusts are are rooted in trans communities, do that, but also make sure that you explain what community land trusts are so that people understand why they're important.
Great. I think like a lot of the ideas that we've expressed, including mutual aid, these are new terms, but these are not new practices, especially within Black and Brown, queer and trans communities. And same thing with the idea around community land trust, which is really just a new way of talking about cooperative relationships with housing and the land that takes profit out of how we do housing, and also to put control back into local communities. And so there's many ways to structure a community land trust from a legal perspective. But I wanted to tie that in with trans history because, you know, Sylvia Rivera was someone who started a house called Star House, and she housed sex workers, queer and trans, people of color. And that is in many ways you can think of as a genesis to the idea of cooperative housing and community land trusts for how we think about it now. And there's also people like Kyan Dorashao and the organization GLITZ that is doing that work today. And so we can support GLITZ and other Black trans-led organizations that are thinking about questions around housing and land. And so that's part of the history, that's what we continue to do. And in terms of more concretely what's happening in New York City and New York State, there are proposals to build capacity among different nonprofit housing organizations in New York City to develop community land trusts across the different boroughs. There's also a bill that State Senator Myrie is proposing for tenants to potentially purchase buildings, and that's pending. But these are all possibilities that we can actually achieve if we fight for it.
Yeah, and just to underscore the point, you know, community land trusts are important because, as we know, in New York City, we have a problem with affordable housing, right? And one of the things that community land trusts do when you have community ownership of the land through nonprofits or these other things is that you actually are able to lower the price of housing because you take the profit motive out of selling parcels and land transfers, right? And so you allow there to be, and you can expand the amount of public housing because those entities can actually borrow against the value of the land to build, you know, lower cost housing. And so of course, real estate and developers hate the idea because that's not how they make their money. But in so many places around the United States, like Baltimore and others, I mean, there are these large scale examples that we can have an alternative way to do housing. And I think that that's the point, is that there's a different way for us to bank. There's a different way for us to build housing. There's a different way for us to have healthcare. There's a different way for us to meet our basic needs. And like, it's important for us to make sure that we center those, you know, so that we give people a sense of hope. While we're on these big ideas, before we turn to specifically what you think the needs are, and the most pressing needs right now are for our community when it regards to economic justice outside of our big visioning, which is where we started with tonight, is this conversation around abolition. And there was a question that I think is really important, and this is jump off for anyone who said, you know, could someone expand on the idea of abolition? Is it the complete eradication of law enforcement? And how would we hold people who don't follow the rules accountable?
I can sort of talk a bit about this. So many things. Number one, I don't think that the only way that I understand abolition and understand abolitionist futures as being possible is through a Black queer feminist lens. And I think this is essential. And I've learned this from in real time in practice now. If people aren't holding the complexities, the nuances of identity and about all of the things we've been talking about tonight and understanding how the capital S state and the cultures that are produced to support said state, like what I'm calling a culture of annihilation, which we know is a white supremacist, heteropatriarchal, anti-LGBTQ, anti-ethnic sentiment, xenophobic, etc. The list goes on, phenomena at play. Abolition is about understanding how all of these phenomena intersect, how they interact and how they produce the conditions that we find ourselves in today. And also so abolition essentially is not just about abolishing prisons. It's not just about abolishing police. It's about offering up a framework of reality that considers the actual origin of violence committed against us, or violence that we commit against each other. And understanding and recognizing the reality that the police and prisons have been in this country for 200 plus years, not the whole time, right? Remember that. This is not a fixed phenomena. It's not an absolute necessity for civilization. They've been around for 200 years. Murder still happens. Black trans people are still being killed. Black people are still being shot by the police themselves. All of the people are still being sexually violated, etc. So clearly the prison and the police have not solved the problem. So abolition is about let's actually get to the deep roots. And again, that word radical is not a scary word. It just means getting to the root. Think about your math classes, and I'm not even a math person. What is actually at play here? So it is ultimately about removing prisons and police from the society, but that means removing the need for police or prisons from the society. And then you want to do that in a way that is systemic and that is responding to the demands and the deep sort of nuanced experiences of the most directly impacted people, if that makes sense. So for me, the way that I understand it is that we want to systemically defund police, right? Systemically just dismantle prisons and jails, but also simultaneously be doing the work to implement all of the things that have been said on this call today, because those are the things that are going to actually produce not only the conditions, but also the culture that allows for us to be able to say, we don't need people walking with guns and batons our streets to protect us from violence against each other or whomever. So it's an abolitionist future. I don't think that abolition happens overnight. I don't even know, and I've always a little bit hesitant to say this. I don't think that tomorrow is the right idea to abolish police totally. I think that this has to happen in conversation, in consideration. For instance, we haven't even mentioned gun violence and what gun violence means for LGBTQ people. And I'm thinking about the Pulse nightclub shootings. And so we've got to be able to address what's really at the core of what's going on. And I think to bring it full circle, and I hope this is specific enough, sort of to what Wynn was saying about what we actually deserve. I think that when you think about things about universal basic income, these are all hinged on the idea that Black Lives Matter, which means it hinges on the idea that because you're a human being alone, you deserve the things that you're getting. You deserve the right to housing, healthcare, education, social services, etc. The gamut of things that make it possible for you to actually be as fully human as possible, because then we get to see what you're actually capable of if you're not thinking all day about how am I going to survive. And abolition is about doing all of that work. And it's just sort of an orientation. It's a direction. It's a sort of way to pull together the streams of thought in a way that is comprehensive and that is towards a thing. And I think that if you're not bringing all that in there, then you don't understand abolition.
Yeah, I think that's really a really important point that you made. A couple of really important points. One, abolition isn't overnight, it's a process. And I think that the embedded in the person's question was, oh my God, if the structures that we have right now go away right now, that chaos ensues. I think one, you laid out a process. Abolition is a process, it's a vision, we have to get there over time. I also think that was really interesting in your framework for abolition, which may help the person that asked the question, is this idea of where does violence originate, right? And so does violence originate from bad people, right? And a few bad people, and therefore you have this carceral state because you have to isolate them, or kind of embedded in your idea, is violence actually the natural outcome of the systems that we've created, right? Is violence the natural outcome of having a scarcity model in economics? Is it a natural outcome of what we have built in terms of racial economics in this country? And so if your idea of abolition, I think it's really important for us to really think about beyond these learnings that we've had around who drives violence in this country, of where violence originates. I think that's a really powerful idea in abolition. Does anyone want to take this idea? You kind of alluded to it and we have clarified it a little bit, I think, but does anyone want to take that the last question, that idea of, well, what do we do with people who break the rules? What do we do with people who violate others? What do we do with that in an abolitionist framework? And I just wanted to connect, hold on, Jason, I see your hand up, we'll come right to you. I just wanted to connect abolition to economics, because we understand that the carceral state that we have right now has become an economic engine of itself, right? Then one of the reasons why we have so many people, that are brought into the carceral state through all these laws that New Pride Agenda and elsewhere are trying to fight against, is because in many counties upstate, those prisons are keeping them afloat, right? For example. And so I think, it does connect to economics, and we have to realize that. So Jason, take that question of, what happens to the people that are committing wrong?
So I'm going to answer your question with a question.
What's that?
When was the last time any of us called the police and expected there to be more safety as a result of that? When have police actually provided safety in your life? And so if we understand that, it's as a rhetorical question and point, police actually are not doing the thing that we think that they're tasked to do, which is providing public safety. And so, is there violence in our communities? Is there trauma? Are there things that are happening between interpersonal connections and relationships? Absolutely. And we need to address that, but we need to address that at the root causes. And we have to actually look at, is the response of sending police actually doing the thing that we wanted to do? And I also just want to underscore that, when we look at the campaign for Say Her Name, so many of the Black women who have been killed by police violence is often when police are sent in response to a mental health issue and crisis, including Black trans women. And so if we understand that, it's the police that killed Akai Gurley, it's the police that killed Deborah Danner, and so many other Black people, then how do we understand public safety when police are the ones committing the violence? So we need to redefine public safety, and we need to redefine what violence is. And that violence is state violence. Violence is police violence. And I think that was a big point that Jawanza was making as well.
Yeah. One question that we've gotten, I can't believe that we actually have to wrap up. I feel like we just got started. I mean, we literally just listed all the things that we needed to do. And then could turn to very specifically about how they would make a difference in people's lives and improve our community. But I think some of these are no-brainers, right? We know since so many of us have experienced housing insecurity, we know what more housing would mean. It would decrease housing insecurity. We know what more economic security through UBI would mean. So hopefully some of these things are apparent, but I can't believe we just got started. But one question that I think is really important is that there have been a lot of ideas that we've spoken about tonight, and many of those ideas have legislative solutions or already are in train for legislation, right? So for instance, public banking would have to be passed by the state. There's already a Medicare for all healthcare bill. And so one question that we got was, how do we hold people accountable? How do we hold elected officials accountable in this moment to bring about real transformative and sustainable change? Since these ideas are big ideas, how do we get people to understand what they are, and how do we get people to pressure their electeds to implement many of the things you brought up tonight?
I mean, I think most immediately, I think what we're doing here right now, like New Pride Agenda and building powerful institutions that can hold the government to account. You know, it's important for some of us to be in said government and trying to sort of like, you know, do work from within, but it is critical that we have powerful organizations that are populated and sort of the vision comes directly from the people that most intimately understand the violence that we're experiencing. And being intentional about that and understanding and being crystal clear about power and about what power is. And it's not just knowing something, it's about being able to do something. So I think you need to build your powerful institutions separate of the government. And number two, I think that we need to make sure that we abolish the ways in which corporations are able to influence who gets into office and what happens in office. And I'm thinking specifically about Citizens United, the bill from the Supreme Court that like the ruling that basically allows for all of this massive amounts of money to be able to be used privately, but basically for public campaigns. So I think we need public finance, you know, public campaign finance reforms. I think that we also need to create the sort of expectation that people that run for public office, it's not a career. You're going to work there for maybe 1 or 2 terms and change positions, or you don't get to stay as a politician for 50 years. It doesn't make any sense. So I think that we need to start holding people account to that. And we just need to be more immediately engaged, but not just as individuals, we need to be in organizations. I think that it makes sense to me for every single person to be a part of an organization, of an institution that meets your values, that operates from a framework of values that you believe in, that account for you and your community, and you need to hold those folks accountable. But also that institution needs to be deeply rooted and connected to the movements around you, because we cannot and I think the last thing I'll say here is just that, like, and also to add to my previous comments, is that, like, I don't know all the answers and about, like, how to respond to violence when it happens to people, but no one as an individual understands the answers, because the world that we need to build is a collectively imagined future. So I can't speak for all people and all experiences, but I know that I can say what is not working, because that's clear.
Yeah. I think it would be interesting to hear Kiara on this point, since part of, you know, talking to legislators and lobbying is a part of your job. I also wanted to let people know that a lot of the ideas that we discussed tonight, I just put a link to in the link chat. There is an organization called the Partnership for Dignity and Rights, and they developed a document which I helped to put together called A New Social Contract, and it actually takes many of the ideas that are laid out here and breaks them down in terms of where they fit historically and how they would work in society. So I encourage you, since you know, our hour went by quickly, to dig into that and to see how we would actually implement some of these big ideas that would have a big economic impact. But Kiara, do you mind telling us how you think we can hold people accountable to making these changes?
Yes, thank you, Imara. So definitely one of the things I always try to stress to everyone that I come in conversation with is the government works for us, right? We don't work for the government. What we see happening is because we are demanding change, and they have no choice but to listen to us. So that is a very important piece that I feel that is missing a lot of the times. A lot of us are somewhat programmed to, well, the government says we can't do this. When reality is, we put them in office, we can get them out of office, just like Jawanza was saying. Like, there's no reason for folks to be career elected officials and they're getting nothing done but just making their own self-interest, you know, getting rich from corporations, buying them off. And that is unacceptable, you know. And so that is one thing that I cannot stress enough. We must make sure we hold our elected officials accountable. And it depends on us to do that. But I also wanted to, because I feel that oftentimes we don't know these things until we do our own research, right? And I wanted to share, like, these conversations, they're not new, right? They're not new what we're having. They've been going on like
forever.
So something that stood out to me a couple of weeks ago is I came across the Gary, Indiana Black Manifesto of 1972. I don't know if folks are familiar with that. But in that, you know, I'm not going to read all of it. It says, So when we turn to a Black agenda for the 70s, I'm going to say for the 2020s, we move in truth of history, in the reality of the moment. We move recognizing that no one else is going to represent our interests but ourselves. Black people organize to advance is coming. We lift up a Black agenda. My phone is recognizing that white America moves towards the abyss created by its own racist arrogance, misplaced priorities, rampant materialism, and ethical bankruptcy. Therefore, we are certain that the agenda we now press for in Gary is not only for the future of Black humanity, but is probably the only way the rest of America can save itself from the harvest of its criminal past. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important because like all the things that we're talking about, you know, that one paragraph, you know, like you know, and I think that well, I know that we live in a world that we forget our history, right? And we forget that there's things that are already set, there's manifestos out there, there's already a plan in place, right? We just have to like find out where to retrieve those plans and how to retweak them for our modern world. And so that's really important. I just wanted to share that with everyone.
Thank you, thank you. That's actually a really good place for us to begin to wrap our panel. We are almost over time, but Jason and Wen, I wanted to give you two the possibility to sort of contribute anything that you wanted to build off of in terms of what's been said, or if you wanted to offer any kind of closing or departing thoughts.
Jason, do you want to go or I can go?
You can go.
Cool. So, I mean, also, you might be able to add some of the thoughts that I'm having because I'm a law student and you are a lawyer. I was thinking a bit about what Jawanza and Kiara were talking about, and particularly that Jawanza had put mentioned Citizens United and like a court case, and I was thinking about just like the importance of educating each other, sharing knowledge, and de-wonking all of the spaces that we, because our systems are so complicated and so confusing, and they're so designed that you have to go into more debt to get more schooling to maybe get the knowledge that you need to know. When really, like, a lot of what I learned for my first year in law school, I was like, wow, I am just getting maybe the suggested readings or the frameworks that I should think in, but I could have learned some of this on my own, at least minimally. And so I think one thing that I feel really a responsibility to is to try and share as much as I'm learning in policy or law. And and I think that we need to do that for each other. Someone had mentioned like where I was thinking a little bit about corporations and like following the money, learning how to read campaign funding, like who is donating to our current elected officials as well as our candidates. We saw a bit of this in New York in the Defund NYPD work that some young people had really taken to spreadsheets and just releasing out candidate donations and elected donations, and really kind of finding a different way to hold our elected officials accountable, which led to, I think, over $30,000 minimum being returned from elected officials on not like, but before they had a vote. And why I'm bringing this up is that even in law school, we're taught a bit about like how, oh yeah, the judiciary may not act in some spaces because we have like, we trust the electoral process, but and that is our way of holding people accountable. But we know that the electoral process is flawed and designed to take power away from us, so that so that our electeds may not represent our communities, may not come from our communities, may not be paid, like they're looking to interests that we might not even know about. And so sharing this knowledge that we build together is really important to me, and knowing that also that we need to advocate together and build power together to push every every institution, every single one of them. And so what does that look like? That looks like local, state, and federal level advocacy. That looks like not just legislative, but also like legislative or like governor or president or mayoral level advocacy. That also looks like the judiciary. We saw like when we think about the wins that we saw with DACA, with LGBTQ workplace discriminations, with June Medical, which was related to abortion. We saw not just good good lawyering, we saw advocacy, we saw organizing, we saw people showing up at the courts, educating each other across the nation, sharing that space together. And so I think that the more knowledge we can share together, the more people we are activating from the community to become organizers, advocates, lawyers, people in all of these spaces, the more we change the world we want.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so, Jason, you, as the last person, you get the benefit of having to make a quick point. So if you can just sort of land the plane quickly here so that we can close out our program, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I want to just underscore the point that Jawanza made around taking action. And I think we have to move from individual to collective action. So that can look like joining membership-based organizations. And it's also following organizations, grassroots organizations that are doing the work and following their calls to action. And so I won't get into all of that, but it's actually not that hard to do that. Once you start plugging into different movements, you start to see, this is how I can contribute and plug in. And the second point I want to make is around intersectional solidarity, which is a thread that I've heard all of our panelists talk about. It's both about centering intersectionally vulnerable communities, including Black trans people, but it's also about connecting different issues and movements because our struggles are interlinked. And I think about Audre Lorde, we don't live single issue lives, and so we don't have single issue struggles. And so intersectional solidarity, it's a point that Angela Davis writes about in Freedom is a Constant Struggle.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. This has been a really engaging and powerful and wide-ranging conversation. I want to thank you all for sharing your views and for your time tonight. I'm now going to turn it over to Ahmed Mohammed, who from the New Pride Agenda, who will help close us out.
Thank you, Imara, and thank you, panelists. It's been an amazing conversation. I'm going to say no words and just pass it off to CD because you guys said everything that's needed to be said. But I just want to thank you guys again. And I want to remind everyone, the recording of this town hall is going to be posted to our website by tomorrow. So you can share it with your networks and we can rewatch it if you want to. So yeah.
Thank you.
Cynthia?
Yes, I need to be unmuted, I think.
No, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. I could comment for 15 minutes or 2 hours, and so it's a challenge. Amazing panel. To my friends and colleagues, Kiara and Imara, thank you. Thank you for doing this for New Pride Agenda. To my new teachers, Jason, Wynn, Jawanza, thank you so much for this education. I may have been a person or two that was asking some basic questions about the language you were using, but we need to learn. So I want to make two comments. One is something like 25 years ago, I was interested in taking on New York State mental health hospitals and how the tremendous amount of the budget was going to state hospitals, and there were homeless all over the streets of New York. And I was asked to give a presentation in front of 500 people at NYU, largely a white elitist crowd, I think you would say. And I tried to encapsulate what was going on. And I did a little bit of what Wynn and some others of you said, which is follow the money. And I put up 3 slides that talked about the tens of millions of dollars that were in state hospitals from New York State taxpayers and budget, the tens of thousands of people that were homeless on the street, and the minuscule number of people that were in state hospitals. And when I put on 3 slides, just simply explaining, here's where the money was, here's where the people are, and here's the disconnect, there is a gasp in the audience. And I thought, you fuckers, I got you. So I think the tremendous knowledge base that you have, and don't give up on us older white people, gay white people, that want to participate and want to be helpful. And to the degree that you could help educate us in a different way, I think we, and certainly the New Pride Agenda, is highly interested in that education and cutting the edge advocacy. And regarding electeds, I think they have to evolve and grow or be replaced. It's just the nature of the business right now and the nature of the movements that need to be done. One final comment, we're saying goodbye to lovely Jason Lamar Walker, who has a full-time job now and therefore won't continue as the consultant for New Pride Agenda. His additions of putting together these virtual town halls has been invaluable. So we send our love and our best, and I hope we could sometime connect again, Jason, and have drinks and hugs. And thank you in person. Thank you all. Please remember New Pride Agenda, our survey. It's all part of our partnership in helping you in the community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.